vism or narrative has been seen as a homilectic plot. It is seen as authoritative. It is seen as controlling and certain kind of power which takes the agency in a participatory collaborative situation. And then again in the 80s, the narrative, the fragmented sections of narrative, the narrative from different, not the Euro-American model, but the narrative from the Middle East, the narrative from the Latin America, the narrative from other parts of the world, the narratives of cinema, the narratives of visual art, the narrative of dance, that created multiple understanding of narrative, and also the various fragmented, overlapping segments of narratives and its elaborations. And also recently, as Hayden White and Frank Anker-Smith has looked at narrative as an opposition to empiricism, and re-looking at the power of the narrative to question certain kind of post-radical time, and then again re-looking at if there is a radical in postmodern can be reorganized and re-looked at through bringing back the narratives and meta-narratives in its various forms. In the area of performance and artistic expression, we were also thinking that this whole narrative, the neo-narrative, the post-narrative, whether they all have had certain kind of tropes and borderlines, whether all these ideas, the idea of contemporary has limited itself to certain kind of definitional domain. Or there are certain images or ideas which necessarily creates a contemporary work. For example, we are again and again thinking that in the Indian context, taking a text, an established text, and fragmenting it, interpolating with other parallel texts, putting visual texts through scenography, through intervention of video material, through intervention of cyber interaction, performing in a black box or a white cube, whether they have again and again created certain kind of idea of contemporary which had been repeated all over the world. And whether there are certain experimentations of the New York Fifth Avenue that got elaborated all over the world as the essentialist idea of newness. And our question was also to look at the works which cannot easily fit within the established or the available theoretical positions. We were also looking at certain works where the work is almost teleological, the theory is pre-decided, and taking up a theoretical idea and then transforming it into a performance had become a trend all over India over the past 2 decades. And also this construction of newness, whether it is a reproducible commodity, whether the contemporary itself has become something which is repeatable and which is possible for mass reproduction. And are there some works which are slipping from this definition, which we really cannot put or fit within the available theory of contemporary art and history? And when we are thinking of these questions, we thought that to invite speakers from different specializations, from art, literature, cinema, theater, because we here at National School of Drama strongly believe that theatre never was and never will be a solo art form, an independent art form. It is not, we also strongly believe that it is not merely an art form, it is a social action. So we need to learn more and more from other muses, theoreticians, and also the social theorists and historians and scientists and many more other practitioners of human knowledge. And we are extremely happy that in the beginning of this seminar, we have Mr. Udayan Vajpayee as the keynote speaker. He hardly needs an introduction, but for our guests from other lands, I would try to give a little introduction for him. He is a poet. He is one of the foremost critic of cultural theory of our country. He has closely looked at both the tradition and the idea of contemporary and the relationship of the Indian art, whether visual, literary, or performing in the context of the world. And the theatre community will always remain grateful to him because of his elaborate collaboration with K.N. Panikkar. K.N. Panikkar being the practitioner, Mr. Udayan Vajpayee had created 3 texts. He has completely relooked at Uttar Ramcharit and reconstructed Kalidas's Shakuntalam, and also had taken up 3 different texts of Kalidas and evolved it in the contemporary situation, through which Panikkar had created very many classical theatre pieces and had given it a new life for formulating a contemporary newness. So I would first request Mr. Udayan Vajpayee to kindly come up and deliver the keynote. Thank you.
Very good morning, friends. It's quite strange that this is called a keynote address because I have hardly any key with me about anything. I will only create problems, in thinking about the narrative. First, I'll start with telling you a story about a great narrative, Mahabharata. And you know that Mahabharata influenced not only India and Asian countries, it has a deep impact even on a film like Star Wars. And George Lucas, I think, went on record saying that he first read Mahabharata. And of course, he did to it what he did. But it has a great influence all over the world. And there is a small story, a narrative about its creation. And of course, this is a kind of legend which a lot of people know. I don't think, is a part of any written thing. But anyway, India is more or less an oral tradition. So the narrative is that when the decision was taken that Mahabharata is to be written, then the question came up that who would write it? Of course, the writer would decide it, but who would take the dictation? So it was decided after a lot of deliberations that Ganesh will be a right choice. Ganesh is one of the great deities with the elephant head, and he is considered to be Vigna Vinayak. I mean, he is the one who removes the obstacles in any work. So the best way was to ask him to write. So then Ganesh comes, of course, and says that, yes, I am ready to write, but on one condition. And the condition is that you will have to continuously speak. You can't stop in between. So Vedavyas agrees. And he said, it's all right. And then Vedavyas says that I also have one condition. So he asked, what is that? So he said, my condition is that you will not write anything without understanding it. So there are various interpretations of that. One of them is, the surface interpretation is that whenever Vedavyas would have some difficulty in moving the narrative forward, he'll put in a very difficult couplet. So the Ganesha will take a lot of time to understand, and by that time, he will develop the further narrative. But I think there's some deeper interpretation of that. And it is, you see, there is a concept of pratibha in Sanskrit. Pratibha is, broadly speaking, is talent. But pratibha actually is something which remains new. In Sanskrit they say that it is nav navo nimesha shalini. It renews itself relentlessly. It always renews itself. And that's what the talent means. And the mind, because it is full of knowns. So in a sense, pratibha produces something new, something as yet unknown. And the mind, which is full of knowns, and full of theories and all that, it just tries to capture the unknown, and convert it into the known, So that whole game takes place in the minds, that this mind full of knowns, when the pratibha brings up something completely new, as yet unknown, the mind tries to appropriate this newness, this novelty, into an available way, into an available model, into an available idea, a known thing. Ganesh is telling Vedavyas that don't allow your mind to appropriate the creation of your pratibha, of your talent. Do not allow this novelty to be appropriated into the knowns. And Ganesh, in turn, Vedavyas is telling Ganesha, the one Ganesh who is going to take the dictation, he says, first find the tradition of what I am saying. To understand, really we should try to ask this question, that what does it mean to understand something? What do we do, as Levi-Strauss once asked, what do we do when we say, what do we mean when we say meaning? In the same way, let's ask this question, that what does it mean to understand something? And I think to understand something in this case is to find the tradition of that. How to place it in a certain tradition. So here is a parable where you produce, where the writer is expected to create a novelty, and yet finding its place in the tradition. And in fact, the better word for tradition is in Sanskrit, that's called parampara, because that also has the same quality, that it renews itself. Now, I think that's a very good way of understanding the relationship of the novelty and the tradition. That it has to be, it is new all the time, and yet it is rooted. And why do I say this rooted? Because once again, and I'm sorry, I'll be giving most of the references from this tradition because I know this tradition better. And anyway, I'm a writer, I'm not a theoretician, in that quote-unquote sense. So I'm more interested in this tradition. There are these three debts that are considered to be very important in this civilization. There are three debts that everybody is born with. I mean, everybody, as one grows, these three debts are there. One is the debt for the nature. That you have a debt to, for the nature, what it has done for you. Number two is the debt for your teachers. I mean, the guru, whatever that teacher has given you, that also becomes a debt. And the third is the debt of the ancestors. Now, these three debts if you combine all three, these three together means a certain relationship to the civilization, which means that all narratives, all creativity has to have a link with the civilization that it comes from. It cannot be independent of that dialogue with the civilization. So that is first thing that that's all fragmented that you would know gradually. The second thing that I want to say is that all narrative forms, whether cinema or theater or novels and whatever, they're all critically dependent on the notion of truth in that particular civilization. And I'm aware that these notions are not fixed. So there is a certain kind of haziness about that, inexpressibility about them. And yet there is a feeling of a certain notion of truth in a particular civilization. For example, in Renaissance, there was this idea, the idea of the truth lying ahead, the utopia. And therefore, you find that a linear perspective was invented, in the painting. And not only in painting, it was in music, it was in the way the writing was being done, it was in the way the plays were being done. And there was this idea of convergence, that everything finally converges into hope, into that vanishing point, which is a point of hope, which in a sense was a special, in painting, it was in a special correspondence to the time. This is idea of time, as you all know, that St. Augustine once said that, the time was going in the circles, and with the one strike of the cross, it has started flowing in straight line. So this straight flowing line, the time moving like that towards the day of judgment, if you translate it into space, that becomes linear perspective. And of course, it's secularized completely. And instead of God there's a hope or utopia. So that this, notion, this imagination of truth here can be now seen in the way the novels, the narratives were written, the paintings were done, and other art forms also came into being. Whereas in Indic tradition, more or less, and now of course it's breaking very fast, but it is still there in everyday life, is that that convergence in music is not there, nor in the traditional painting. Even the paintings being done now of the tribal painting. I know of a very great tribal tradition painting, which are narrative paintings actually. This is, a Gond community which has ruled central India for around 400 years, and their musicians and storytellers who were one, because they would tell the story in music, they have suddenly become, a few years back, painters. So they paint narrative paintings, and there is no convergence in that painting. There are folds of time there. So there you will not find any, and they have no exposure to what happened in early 20th century with people like Paul Klee, etc. So there is no convergence there. So the story is there without this idea of convergence, nor do you find any such convergence, let's say, in the miniature paintings. Now, if you read or see this wonderful work of B.N. Goswami, he's a great theoretician of the miniature works, you will find that in these paintings there is hardly any linear perspective, there is hardly any convergence. And all are as if the space, instead of going into this depth, is coming up like this. And the space is organized in such a way that there is no convergence whatsoever. And the alternative of the painted convergence in the narrative is idea of climax. That, all Hollywood and even the Bombay cinema is full of that, In fact, I remember that when I would go to see the film as a child, and if I reached the door, which would take me to the hall where film was being shown, the gatekeeper will tell me, just wait for 5-7 minutes more, because the last fight is taking place. This last fight was the climax, where the resolution would take place. So the last fight takes place, and the resolution is no idea, of everything, coming at one point, meeting at one point. And I think it has something to do with the notion of truth in pagan traditions, and India is no different. And it is that everything, each and everything, is truth. It is not an abstracted idea of the truth, but in a sense, everything, every particle, every being is truth. And the whole attempt of work of art or a narrative is to uncover that. In fact, the 10th century, great thinker of poetry, Anandavardhan, he said, one of the tasks of the poetry, of a great poem or a good poem, is to uncover the extraordinary in the ordinary things. Which means everything is potentially divine, and the divinity has to be uncovered, and that is what the work of art does. A work of art intends to, of course instinctively, because of the very nature of the artist, it attempts to uncover that truth or divine in everyday particles. And that is considered not only with Anandavardhan, even late, with a lot of other poeticians that you will find something like that. Even in music, for example, in India, there is no convergence. I mean, it is possible for a great musician to continue singing if he or she has that potential ad infinitum. I mean, that rag will not be finished because rag is potentially infinite. A certain figure of rag, you can go on elaborating it, till you can. But the rag, the potential of the rag is not exhausted, even then. So because there is no idea of convergence, so the musical forms here are quite different. They are divergent. They are not attempting to meet at one point, but they go on being elaborated. And the potential of the musician makes it possible for that elaboration to take place. And at the same time, you see Bharat in his Natya Shastra, in his dramaturgy, says that the music actually forms the bed of the riverbed kind of a thing of the play, of the performance. Which means that music, in a sense, is like a microskeleton of the narratives or of the theatre. To a great extent, I think, cinema. That it forms that, microskeleton, and on which, in that way, the film, more at the theatre, more in the case of theatre, theatre goes like that. Or this, narrative, of course, is woven like that. Even Mahabharata, if you want to understand the expense of Mahabharata, or in a sense, if you want to understand the form of Mahabharata, and if you know to some extent about the Margi, music of India, it will be very easy. Because it develops, it elaborates itself the way the music in India is elaborated. And there are like certain principles of that elaboration. And these principles, of course, are followed, and the narrative moves like that. For example, and this you will find in even all folk theatres, in Nacha, in Tamasha, these are all great folk performances, or in something like Thayyam in Kerala. what happens here also, they have just 1 or 2 lines of any event, let's say. And then they will develop that line. They will elaborate on that line. So something new would come. And then from there they'll take up and something new would emerge from there. And they, more often than not, the actor, who is also actor, come director, come everything, you know, she will go on the stage and will go on elaborating it to the extent he or she can. And of course, the form that is created is not random. It follows a certain musicality. It follows a certain way. I would not say pattern, but it follows a certain way of doing that. And they can, with just 1 line, they can do it for hours together. And that becomes possible only because in traditions like India, which are pagan traditions, there's this, in art form, there's an attempt to search for that, to discover or to uncover that divine, and it's not as if to communicate what is known. You know, it is to all the time search for that. So it's an endless search, so you find different ways of, doing elaboration that you find in the dance forms also. I mean, something like a very great drama form called Kudiyattam in Kerala. One person will stand there and with this lamp being lit, you know, which the height of the lamp will always be much less than the height of the actor. And there will be these, light from there, from the oil, and the entire chamber will be dark. The audience is sitting in front, so the face gets embossed because of a certain kind of lighting. And just 1 line or 2 lines of a play of Sanskrit, which is a great playwright, first playwright of Sanskrit called Bhasa, from him they'll take 1 or 2 lines and will go on elaborating it. And this can happen for, 1 act of Bhasa, which is how much? Some 100 lines or even less, maybe 60 lines. This can continue for 36 nights, this elaboration. And how do they do that? That whatever character comes, let's say one, character from Mahabharata comes in that play, then they will go into all possible narratives of that character and then come back there. It's something very much same thing which happens in music also, that you are, let's say, developing a ray, the second note, let's say. So you go on developing that note for as much as you can, and then you can come back to the, which is called, you put a mohra, you put a seal on that elaboration, and then you come back and take another note and go on developing it. So there is no, in Kudiyattam, of dance forms like Kudiyattam, this, elaboration can be, and it is very, it's very musical, the way they, musical when I don't mean that they, the way the Sound of Music kind of a film. No, musicality is very subtle and, inside, it's like a microskeleton of that acting. And they will go on developing, and not only that, they will also bring in certain very contemporary kind of a thing. Of course, contemporary is a bad word, in any case, everything is contemporary. When you read an old text, it becomes contemporary because at least one of the two is contemporary. So, something has happened. I'll tell you a very interesting incident. That there was this, a few lawyers went to a very great Chakyar performer. He was called Chachu Chakyar. He was a great performer. And they said, that there's a hell of a problem with us in the courts. This happened some 50 years back. And, whenever we are arguing in that court, the judge goes to sleep. So please do something. So he said, okay, I'll try. How do I tell judge to do what he wants to, and etc. So he said, okay, but I'll try. Now he was performing Mahabharata. And there is a incident there when something is happening in the court of the king Dhritarashtra. So someone is saying something to Dhritarashtra. Of course, both the characters were performed by Chachu Chakyar. So he says something, and from Dhritarashtra nothing comes. Then he says it again. Nothing comes from the side of the Dhritarashtra. So this person who is arguing before Dhritarashtra, he asks him, Mr. Dhritarashtra, are you sleeping? So suddenly this judge was also sitting in the front row. He immediately understood the suggestion which was being made. So they could bring in, because the form was such open, and yet it was a form. It was not formlessness. It was a form. It is a form, and yet the form is in such a way, it is created in such a way that everything gets included in that. Now, like even in the Dastan Goi, this is which has come from the Persia up to India, even in Dastan Goi, the narrator can go on, this happens even today, and even is the incorrect usage there, it happens today. Dastan Goi is there, there's a big audience for the Dastan Goi, and this person will go on describing, let us say, a dress of certain character for, something like George Perec, for 1 hour or something like that. Will go on and on and on. Something similar happens in Pena of Manipur. This is a very great tradition of the Pena narratives. Someone will describe the cotton flower, let's say, in great detail, and will not tell the name of that flower, and then will shift to the narrative, and then this great description and all. And why this becomes possible? Because there is this notion which was formulated by Muhammad in 12th century. He says that the poetry is niyatikrit niyam rahitam. The poetry or the narratives is free of the laws of the nature. It creates its own grammar, its own laws. And because it creates its own laws, they are created in such a way that the improvisation can take place. Now here, because when we talk about this truth in every particle and everything is truth like that, it may get confused with an idea of what postmodernists are now doing. But in postmodernism, the belief is that the many truths can coexist, that the ethnic truths and all that, they can coexist. So it's like a culture of polytruths. It's like many truths together, which I think is a great movement which has happened. But in Indic civilization, the idea is that everything is truth and you need to unveil it. And that is considered to be the work that the art or narrative or poetry or theatre does. Now there's another story that I want to tell you. There is a story, a very, very interesting story about the origin of painting, which is almost like a story of origin of arts in Indic civilization. And this is there in a text called Chitra Darshanam. And there's a small story attached to even this narrative. The Chitra Darshanam was written in Sanskrit, then it was translated into Tibetan, and then it was lost in Sanskrit, it remained in Tibetan, in Bhot, and then early 20th century it was translated into German. From German it was translated into English. From English it was retranslated back into Sanskrit and then came back. So this big round it has taken, and it talks about the origin of painting. And it says that there was a king called Bhayjit. Bhay means fear, Jeet means who has conquered his fear. And in his kingdom, nobody would die timeless death. Untimely. Nobody will die an untimely death. Once a child dies, And the father of the child comes to the king and asks him, something wrong must have happened in your ruling or in your kingdom that this, my boy, died. You bring him back. You bring my child back, because in your kingdom nobody can die an untimely death. So first king inquired in the affairs of his ruling and all, and found that no, nothing wrong has happened. So there must be a divine error. So the best way to do is, he was a king, so he attacked the other world. And he attacked the god who is in charge of bringing the souls of the dead to the other world. And in that other world, because the souls live without bodies, so they're called the nagnas, the nudes. So all the nudes live in that world. And he attacked that world and defeated the Yamaraj there, the one who brings those souls. And but Yamaraj told him, he said, that's not my fault. I was asked to bring the soul of that boy, so I did. I don't make decisions. You go to other god. So he went to Brahma, this other god, the creator, and of course the regulator. And he spoke to Brahma, and he said, what is this? How come a child of my kingdom was, his soul is being taken away? So Brahma also inquired and found out, yes, a mistake has happened. A mistake has happened. So he said, the king said, Bhayajit said, you bring back that child to me so that I can go back. He said, I can't. I can't give back the child in the same body. So what you do is, you make a painting of that boy, and I'll put soul in that. So the king painted the boy, and the king put soul into that. Now, in a sense, the two things here is that the art, the work of art, is to bring back those who are not there, to give body to the absences. That you give body to, for example, Proust gave his words to that whole Cambrai life, which was happening in his childhood, and they were brought back into search of the lost time. The dances of Radha and Krishna, etc., the actors and actresses, they lend their bodies to the Radha and Krishna so that they can make appearance. And not only in painting, in theatre, in poetry, in wherever, the actor actually lends his or her body for that absent one to make an appearance. And now, when this body is lended to that absent, and it can also be a value. Need not be a character as such, but certain values are created through the history, and these people in the other world, those who have died, they have also created certain value system. Those values can also be embodied. They can also be brought back on the, brought back on this world. But when they are brought back, they need not follow the rules of the laws of the nature that they used to follow in the previous incarnation. In a sense, you can find that very much there in Kerala, where you have this very great tradition of Thayyam. This is a kind of, all these divisions actually are terrible, the ritualistic theatre and all this. But anyway, what happens is that this actor, this happens in many villages of the North Kerala, and the he will get possessed by one of the souls, of the soul of either a very brave boy or a man or a woman or whatever of that village, and then would perform. Thayam actually also means Devam, and Devam is equitable to death, to ancestors. So the Thayam is actually, this whole theory is in operation. You can actually see that in the most naked form, that a certain possession takes place of the actor, and then actor performs. So the performance actually takes place after the possession takes place. And there are rituals in which that possession is allowed. I mean, the possession takes place, and when the process of possession is over, only then the actor is able to perform. In a sense, I am trying to say that all the stories are actually ghost stories. And when these absences they are brought back into the world, they, by following the laws of the art, not of the nature of the Brahman, of the Brahma, they then help in unveiling or experiencing the truth. I don't know how much time I'll just finish it in 5-10 minutes. I have so many stories to tell anyway. I'll just tell you another thing about this is painter, one of the great painters of 20th century. He, in a sense, says something. He has done something which I think is very important for all of us, whether we come from Indic civilization or from Western or whatever. And what he did, I think, for the first time, which was very much there in the theatre of Natya Shastra of India. You see, people believe that this idea of alienation was Brecht's. Of course, he theorized it in these many words. But actually, if you read the Natya Shastra, which is like more than 2,000 years old, they describe 4 kinds of abhinayas, which 4 elements of acting. One is, angik, which means the acting with arms, with eyes, with torso and everything. Then vachik, which means the spoken. And the third is the aharya, which means that the costumes and property and all that. And fourth, of course, is sattvic, which means that your relationship with that character. Now, there are 2 positions in that. Either you completely get possessed, like in Thayam, by the character, or you are partially possessed by the character, or you are not possessed at all. All these are, instead of representing that character, you can present a certain character. That's all possibilities are there. In Natya Shastra, and in the practice of the Natya Shastra, these 4 things, which means the spoken, the various elements of the angik, of the acting with the body, and the sattvic, that means the character, they must always make sentences. They should come in sequence. In everyday life, that there is no sequence like that. When I say you, so I put my finger and the speech together. But Natya Shastra suggests, and the practice of Natya Shastra in Kudiyattam even today, and in folk theatre, they separate the 2. Now, it depends that how much can they be separated. And the narrative is not only the narrative which is being, spoken or acted in the angik or in the spoken, but actually narrative is also between the gap, unfolds in the gap between these 2 elements. That's a very abstract kind of a narrative. I'll just come to it a bit later. So which means that already the alienation is taking place. You are aware that the acting is there. And it's a very intricate. The way the actors are trained in, let's say, Kudiyattam, there's a family of the Kudiyattam dancers in Kerala, in southern India, and they are called Chakyars. And these Chakyars, there's a whole community of Chakyars, and they are trained for something like 20 years or even more than that. And they, every off and on, they come together and they discuss about the intricacies of the spoken, intricacies of the, angik, or the acting by that, the satvik and all that. And they create these different joints, these different gaps between these, and make these sentences of the different elements and, elements within those elements in different ways. The sentences are being created. Now, in European tradition, in painting tradition, Van Gogh was one of the first, Van Gogh. And what he did was that he created a gap between the material and the illusion that the material creates. He used to paint with the tube, using the tube directly, most of the time. So when you see a Van Gogh painting, actually nobody should see the reproductions of Van Gogh. They are very poor. But when you see the Van Gogh painting, if you go closer to that painting, there's only material that you are seeing. It's the colors. And when you come back a while, you can actually see that Van Gogh, for the first time, the material never disappears after creating the illusion that it is used for. The materiality remains there and the illusion together. And the painting is also the movement between the two. Between, you can go from the material to the illusion, that's that bridge that he has painted. So you go from the colors, various blue, white, yellow and all, these colors to the bridge and back. This movement takes place between the material, and that is something. And not only that, I think he is one of the first painters, where even the object is a narrative. I'll tell you how. He never paints a tree. He paints treeing, the way you use flaming. The tree in Van Gogh is continuously being made. It is as if the narrative of creation of the tree is painted in the tree. So he doesn't paint the end product called tree. But if you see Van Gogh carefully, if you see the cathedral, you can find that the process of the creation of cathedral is endless there in his painting. So there are two narratives there. One between the material, two movements between the material and the illusion, and one between the object and the process of its being coming. So and it in a sense connotes with what we have seen in Natya Shastra, then when the four elements are separated. Now, in a sense, I'm trying to come to this idea that there is always a delay between the gesture and the meaning, between the word and the meaning. In fact, the tradition says that all literary works, artistic works, have the like in poetry or literature, there is word and the meaning. It is togetherness of the word and the meaning which makes literature. Which means their relationship is dynamic. It is not as if that the word can be exhausted into the meaning that it gives. Really a great work of art, of poetry or narrative, is the one where this relationship is so dynamic that every time you read a poem or a narrative, every time a new meaning comes into being because their relationship changes. It's a very dynamic relationship. And same happens between the gesture and the meaning and the bhava, the sense that you get out of that. Like in all great films. I must have seen, the Kamal is here, his film some 20 times. And every time that, because that it is made in such a way that the meaning and this, that whatever is producing that meaning, the gesture, the color, the the light and everything. It is so dynamic that it never gets exhausted. It goes on, so the movement is all the time between these two, and there is always a delay between the two. I mean, once you realize what it is or what it can be, there is always a delay. And I think, as a poet, I can say that you play with these delays. They are called the micro durations, which actually take place in you. They are unbroken, what we call in Sanskrit tradition as chandas. They are chand. There are these, this time unfolding in you between the gesture and the meaning, between word and the meaning. And this has its own beautiful micro, duration. And the series of duration, these abstract duration, more often than forms what is called narrative. So every narrative, the quality of the narrative, the difference in the narrative is, one fundamental reason is that the architecture of these delays in various narratives is different, and it gets renewed, if you are aware, if you don't allow, if we come back to our first story, if you don't allow your mind to appropriate these narratives and put them into some kind of one slot, then this narrative, the possibility of novelty in all these narratives remains incessant, endless. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Please take it.
Where is my...
Thank you so much, Mr. Vajpayee, for such a wonderful speech, and putting different arts, different centuries, and different cultural practices, different demographies together to really give a wonderful start to the other sessions. And if the audience is intrigued about some of the propositions that he had done, we can do that at the end of the first session as a common questions together. I would now request the speakers and the chair of the next session to come up. The next session is on the definition or the definitions of narrative, how it had been defined or not defined or had been tried to define over very many periods of time and places. We are very happy that we have Dr. Tapati Gupta as the chair for this session, who is the former professor and head of the Department of English of Calcutta University, and his area of, her area of specialization remained Shakespeare, literature and other arts, intercultural theatre, and translation studies. She had many publications in her credit, with articles on theatre studies, translations, adaptation of Ibsen and Shakespeare's plays in Bengal for Bengal stage. She had remained a member of IFTR and ISTR. For ISTR, she has served her term as vice president. She also had been a member of Shakespeare Society of India, and she was part of the Ibsen Between Cultures research project of the Ibsen Center, Oslo University. We have with her Dr. Vishnupriya Dutt, and I am reading her little introduction from her latest book, which had been published by Orient Black Swan, The Gendered Citizenship Manifestations and Performance. And it's so difficult to introduce Vishnupriya because I know her for so many years as a friend. Vishnupriya Dutt is Professor of Theatre and Performance Studies in the School of Art and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. Her area of research includes colonial and post-colonial theatre histories, feminist readings of Indian theatre and popular culture. Her recent publications include Performing Resistance with Maya Rao, Trauma and Protest in India, Contemporary Theatre Review, August 2015, and Engendering Performances, Indian Women Performers in Search of an Identity with Urmimala Sarkar, 2010. She was co-principal investigator with Janelle Reinelt of the project, Gendered Citizenship, Manifestations and Performance. But she is also a very, very capable actress. I have seen her many, many times on stage, and she is a director, and her also creating performances and acting is an extension of the performance research which she otherwise puts into words. And we are also very grateful that she had been able to take her time out. We have with us, do we have with us?
Yes.
Mr. Kamal Saru? Okay, let him come back. He has made the most dramatic exit. I'll introduce him later. Okay, we do have Mr. Kamal Sarup with us, who had made a dramatic exit and an entry. When I asked him to how I may introduce him, he said very modestly that he has studied at Film and Television Institute of India, and he has made certain films. One of them is Om Darbadar, and then recently he is making documentaries, and he has also taught at different film universities. But this surely definitely doesn't encompass Kamal. I had seen Om Darbadar as many years back, and it's absolutely a cult film which changed the narrative storytelling of Indian cinema once and for all. It remained one of the most controversial and the discussed cinema of the better part of the last century and also this century. And also his recent intervention about Dada Saheb Phalke, and looking at Dada Saheb Phalke is the historically taken as the first filmmaker whose film has remained into existence. And his intervention into the idea of Dada Saheb Phalke and the filmmaking is an investigation of an art form through the art form itself. And I'm sure that he will talk about his projects by himself, but to many generations, almost for 3 generations by now, he is almost a cult artist. And we have with us Nicola Pianzola, who is one of the major performer director from Italy, and he has come again and again in India, and over past few years he has developed a particular relationship with India and its performance scene. His strongly political work and commentary on our time through spoken and unspoken word, and through the vocabulary of the body and gesture and the object that had intrigued the Indian audience. I can only talk about the work in India which we had been able to see, which had intrigued the Indian audience over and over again for a fair part of last half a decade almost. And his contribution in India is not only in creating performances, but his sincere and the most dedicated attempt to hand over his methodology to this subcontinent, to the students, that had created a definitive interest in different parts of the country. And despite different cultural patterns and different trainings of the body theatre, trainings of the spoken theatre, trainings of the object theatre, looking at the image works, Nicola has intervened in many different parts. And we also have Mr. Vasudev Kamath with us. Vasudev Kamath is one of the most senior and important visual artists of our country. After receiving GD Art in Painting from Sir J.J. School of Art, Mumbai, 1977, in first class first with distinction and gold medal, he continued his art journey through painting, portraiture, landscape, meaningful, conceptual and subjective paintings. He has had many worthy solo exhibitions and also participated in major art society shows. He has bagged many prestigious awards, to name a few: Annual Art Exhibition Gold Medal, Bombay Art Society Gold Medal, the Draper Grand Prize by Portrait Society of America, Salon International, San Diego Watercolor Society, and many more. Recently, Vasudev Kamath was awarded Portrait Signature Status membership by Portrait Society of America. He works in all mediums and equally master in handling watercolors with its nature of flow and transparency. Besides landscapes and portraits, Vasudev paints the visions of his inner self. These visions are conceived from innocent curiosity of a child at one level, and at the other from saintly wisdom of a profound thinker. His conceptual paintings are representations of the deep-rooted subconscious of mankind. A stalwart in the art of portrait painting of contemporary Indian art, Sri Vasudev Kamath is the founder, trustee and visionary of Portrait Artists Group. His contribution towards creating awareness for art and artists in common people, and also to bridge the gap between art and the society, is immense. He travels all over India for his mission with slideshows and talk shows, and also with painting demonstrations in various mediums. For the aspiring artists, his books, portraits, sketching and drawing, and my paintings and thoughts behind them have been guiding and inspiring source. The title of this session is narrative, the visual narrative and the textual narrative, and I'm defining. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm extremely sorry. It's must be my not sleeping last night. It started slipping out of my head. It's the defining narrative, and we are looking forward to the speakers and the chair to have their wonderful comments, their thoughtful comments on the same. Yeah, if you can.
I can.
Yeah, please. And now I invite the speaker and the chairs to kindly come here. Please do. And if we a little bit of the center stage.
Shall I change this first because I come first?
Yeah, why not?
Change? Something is wrong. It's not mine.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Shantanu, for that elaborate introduction. You have really simplified my task. Well, I must say that I consider myself very privileged to be chairing such a distinguished panel. And everyone is, we are eager to listen to what they have to say about their own work. But I will begin by a few remarks in general, because, Mr. Vajpayee, you have really opened up new perspectives on the Mahabharata and the narrative, for which all of us are extremely thankful. Now, the notion of the narrative, it's now really a notion, but I think one should be aware of the historical development of the concept. Well, of course, it's very fundamental to all literatures, to drama, to performance. Well, anything that tells a story is a narrative. But then I think our lives are made up of embedded narratives which surface only when, as Mr. Vajpayee pointed out, there is an undercurrent within us, and it surfaces only occasionally, and then we require an artist or a writer or a theatre person to put it before an audience or a listener or a spectator or a listener. Now, of course, anything that tells a story is a narrative, but this telling today is not confined to telling alone, but the fundamental concept inherent in it is both telling and showing, which I hope our panelists will make obvious to you. And of course, we have moved away from the structuralist viewpoint and of course from the classical viewpoint in which a narrative was supposed to have sequentiality, it was supposed to be a chronological account, it was supposed to have a linearity, its structure, it was supposed to be reliant on causality, it was supposed to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But then post Second World War, this notion of order, well, structure suggests order, but this notion of order was fractured, devastated, and a new layer of reality, a new concept of reality emerged, and which is really very, very pertinent to life. Because is there any order in life? No. Our lives do not have any order. Just as the painter discovers lines where there are no lines. There are no lines in nature. It's for the painter to find out the lines. So there is no order in reality. So the notions of linearity to sequentiality to the notion of closure is deconstructed, I suppose, never to return. The treatment of time, place, and space, therefore, has also become something related to modern developments of psychology, to the inner self, to individuality, to history, to culture. And, well, Rolla Barthes once said that narrative is international, trans-historical, trans-cultural. It is simply there, like life itself. And as I said, we every day embedded narratives surface, whether we are aware of it or not. So, of course, narrative is concerned with formation of text. And the idea of text and textuality has also suffered a sea change. And then we have recognized the process of narrative making as a narrative by itself. We no longer refer back to the grand narrative or the source narrative. It is no longer something hegemonic. So it has lost that power because we are living in an age of fragmentation. And it is no longer possible to think about narrative as a totality. So, and especially with postmodernism, marginality becomes the center, and the center becomes marginal, and there is no distinction between the high and the low, and therefore all kinds of narrative are accepted. There is no hegemony. So, the narrator is no longer the confident, omniscient person he once was, because the narrator also discovers within himself many dichotomies, dualities, ambiguities. He is not living in a very stable world. And then what has become very prominent in the creation of narrative is the importance of multiple meanings. It was always there, but somehow with reader response theory, well, I'm a literature person, so occasionally I fall back to parables related to literary criticism. So meaning has also become unstable. There is not the only essentialist meaning. And we recognize that meaning evolves out of the perception of the audience, the reader, the spectator, the listener. but there is the plurality that postmodernism so gloats upon, and all meanings are valid meanings. There is nothing invalid. So it's a great democratization, I think, of narrative. So I don't want to waste time speaking or generalizing, but one more thing is that one thing remains constant. Without sugar? Remains constant, that is, narrative is still concerned with not only what is related, but how. The how factor still remains, the discourse aspect. So narrative has become various voices, and also as, environmental theatre activists will know that it is also space related, and it has to change the how in accordance with not only who it is speaking to, but also the space and the culture, the point of history in which something is being shown. So that, I hope, would be clearly analyzed by our speakers today, who belong to 4 distinct fields of creativity. Now, the tools of, we have to acknowledge that rhetoric is the fundamental tool of narrative making. And after all, we are speaking about rhetoric, and the rhetoric of these different practitioners become very important in the narrative that they are trying to create. And of course, and this relates to a different session, I suppose, but I can't resist myself from speaking about it. In this digital age, the rhetoric of the new age is the digital rhetoric. And I think you are also using technology of the digital age. So that cannot be avoided. So a new rhetoric is evolving through personal video, social media, digital imagery, multimedia games. And so the process of narrative creation has become multi-dimensional, more so than it was previously, than it was with the advent of modernism, than it was post-World War II. So it has opened up more scope for interactive, creation of meaning, the interaction between the reader and the creator. So the focalization, which is also a very important aspect of narrative creation, that becomes complex. If not fractured, it is there. You have multifocality, not a single hegemonic area of power, not a single focal point, but multiple, and that is obvious from modernist art, from that period itself. In visual art, I think the Cubists. So now I invite Professor Vishnupriya Dutt to present her paper, and please, we should, I think, try to confine ourselves to 20 minutes, though each of us have taken up a lot of time, but I want to give them full scope to present their narrative.
Thank you very much, and with all my previous speakers, mine is related, but as a theatre historian, it is sort of rooted into a certain historical examples, and it's a work in progress, which is my larger work on writing histories of, the multiple sort of layers of theatre, particularly the political theatre. So I come from there, and this is, my work in progress. I would love your feedback. And I would like to thank Shantanu and the National School of Drama for this, opportunity to speak here. Narratives often described as the grand narratives of European modernity are often regarded to have come to India through colonialism and subsequently a sequential phase of colonial and post-colonial modernities, which are mapped as history of modern Indian theatre. A critique of post-coloniality as a derivative discourse, I would like to argue, can be referred to only in theatre and performance practices which emerged from the state's visions, a cultural policy of a new nation wanting to celebrate its new independent status, and its institutional spaces, a significant one being where we are located today, the National School of Drama. The eloquent rhetoric and ardent urge of theatre personalities gathered from all over India at the drama seminar in 1956 had offered multiple means of how the state could offer support to theatre in various regions and states. But ultimately, it was the National School of Drama, which was probably the only institution which came up with the nomenclature of drama. The drama school focused, I argue, on training young adults to be nurtured into citizen artists of the new nation, and the mnemonics of Al-Qazi's production-oriented theatre training was indeed a mode of celebratory grand narratives depicting potentialities of progress interwoven with the Nehruvian visions of unity in diversity. By simple logic, then, I would like to argue, and I would like to draw a contrast between the state's theatre projects, the statist theatre projects, and its grand narrative tropes, which Partha Chatterjee refers to as the pedagogical, and the other theatre which within the new democratic practices and the crucial transition from colonial subjecthood to post-colonial citizens took on an agonistic and antagonistic position to the state from its inception in the 1960s. I'm referring here to the progressive amateur theatre movement and what Shamik Bandyopadhyay describes as the euphoria of independence being over and the first shock of disillusionment being giving way to a criticality that sought to explore in terms of theatrical abstraction, political, philosophical and psychological issues left shelved in the years of nationalist struggle to be prioritized only after independence. I further apply Nicholas Rideout's argument of the passionate amateurs and its choice in terms of not adopting the economic logic of a culture industry with its complex notion of time, progress, production and profit. This I'm referring to the amateur theatre movement. To retain its autonomous positions and participate in the active public sphere of post-independent India, when theatre could exist as a critical and significant institution. If the state was celebrating the nation and its grand narrative tropes, and this is my argument, I would like to argue that the new political theatre which emerged in the mid-60s outside these state institutional spaces actually had to deconstruct the grand narrative of post-colonial modernity. By its very self-fashioning, the autonomous political criticality, it challenged the very tenets of modernity and democratic structures which the nation was celebrating by questioning its exclusive criteria based on religion, class, caste, and gender. To deconstruct the grand narrative, the critical theatre, I would argue, anchored itself into the historical archives of the nationalist movement and the contemporary issues to challenge the new nationalist elites' systematic monopolization of power and privileges. These archives of documentary evidence, influenced directly by Erwin Piscator and Bertolt Brecht, were the idioms and vocabulary which constructed a collage of various fragments of the local, national, and even international historical documentary material to challenge the grand narratives of the nation and in the process fracture the Aristotelian coda so structural to the dramatic narratives. The documentary genre then functioned to complicate notions of authenticity with a more nuanced and challenging with a more nuanced and challenge to the grand narratives of the nation, or to complicate notions of authenticity with a more nuanced and challenging evocation of the real. By extension, audiences are often actively engaged in dialogue as citizens and putative participants in the public sphere. Although the documentary form has always been and remains a powerful tool for polemic and advocacy, the way in which these are instantiated have evolved to include means other than a central controlling narrative voice or dominant point of view, based on material and invariably textual notion of the document. It indicates a self-conscious acknowledgement of the complexity of reality at the expense of propounding a monodimensional truth claim that is constituted by means of selective editing and tendacious narrative construction. It situates the same material as an embattled site of contestations. In this context, as an example, I would like to refer to what I read as one of the first expressions of political theatre in post-independence India. And this is 1964, it runs for 4 years. And in Thomas Postlethwaite's critical framework, when a theatrical event is transposed as a political event. The play, which was presented in the documentary style, depicted the naval mutiny which broke out just prior to Indian independence in 1947. A militant movement led by sailors and commoners who urged for a more radicalization of the nationalist movement implied a need to address historically and also in the present the issues of social citizenship. The play called Lol was based on historical archives, most of them made non-accessible to the citizen artists on grounds of high security, but supplemented by newspaper reporting and testimonies of mutineers, some published, but also actual testimonies from survivors who survived from the ruthless court-martial and executions to tell their stories. The narrative of the naval mutiny was intercepted with narratives which emerged from various other sources, constructing a lateral intervention from other historical moments and locations, namely the Berlin Ensemble at the German Democratic Republic, where Dat had just seen the optimistic tragedy, and also in USSR. The presence of the ship and its references to numerous mnemonical revolutionary narratives, the Potemkin, Aurora, were narratives which came to represent the new narrative forms. Hence, the narrative of the revolt was deliberately fragmented through its various reference points and other memories of revolutionary narratives of naval mutinies and visions of revolutions. The fragmented documentary narrative, in that sense, was not only the story of a past, but held promise for a future and could, in the times, be read as what Etienne Balibar would read as work sites of democracy. A recent art installation by the modernist artist Vivan Sundaram, and it's happening now also at the Kiranadar Gallery, is commemorating the 70 years of the naval mutiny as a failed insurrection. The installation is in many sense a postmodern narrative, with all the archives which were used as documentary evidence in Kollur are exhibited in the gallery, with a very large ship at the centers. Visitors are invited to enter the hull of the ship, a darkened space with sitting on all sides, to listen to a 20-minute audio track telling us the story of the naval mutiny through testimonies collected by the artist and his collaborator Ashish Rajadhaksha from British War Museums. Coming from an archive representing power, it tells a story from a cynical perspective, that it was nothing more than some sailors trying to demand better conditions and pay. What fragments this narrative of cynicism and failure are actually the audio pieces which represent the play Kallol, the poems from the time, songs by the Indian People's Theatre Association, and amidst the newspaper cartoons, a spectacular painting by the artist Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh. The artistic creativity of a past performance idiom is the only means to break down historical narratives which comes with power. The point which I'm trying to make is that Vivan Sundaram's work read from the contemporary historical perspective, is indeed a post-modern, post-colonial, and in that sense, a post-narrative experience. And that is due mainly to the artistic creativity, which is now the evidence of the affect which the revolution had created, and which I'm arguing lives through these works of arts. To look back and use the same criteria of theoretical frameworks to the 1960s is, of course, ahistorical, and I don't even want to attempt it. But 60s experience, what should be understood, what for the audience of the time, what the narrative structure meant. The documentary style broke and startled the audience out of its expectations that the story of the revolt could unfold as a grand alternative narrative. Instead, what they were confronted with were evidences of the history, documents and testimonies, reinterpretation of a political event which was still in a public memory, and creating a dialogue between the real and the imagination. As Janelle Reinert points out, that even the documentary presented as the real is always enacted, just like it was in Kallol, just like it is in Vivan's work. But the enactment in the real is the general evident to the audience and the reader. She says, documentary theatre is politically engaged and summons public consideration of aspects of reality in a spirit of critical reasoning. Following a Bakhtinian vision of Habermas, the theatre evokes a public sphere that can act as a non-institutional forum for public debate based upon a wide variety of expressive concerns. From this point, I would like to see the notion of the documentary drama, which created a different narrative structure from the documents, which at that historical period were critical and were the reference point. And then I would just like to go a little after 64 to this very important year internationally, globally, and in India, which is, of course, 1968, where I'm saying even a sort of Kallol, where you take the documentary evidence to create a sort of imaginary narrative, had to be broken down. And in the 50 years of 1968, which is this year an important landmark in both India and Europe and all over the world, I would like to understand what were in these documentary remains of a historical time which was imperative for the theatre to adopt and also use to intervene within the larger celebratory grand narratives of the nation. As part of my own research, I would like to retrieve the archival documents from the cityscape of Calcutta, which were finding its path into the new theatrical expressions, assuming more and more radical overtones. These were remains of street protest, mass mobilization, people out in the streets to protest blatant subversion of democratic norms. Twice in 18 months, the elected governments of the state had been dismissed and governors rule imposed. The left parties calling for mass demonstration, protests and demands to restore the democratic electoral process. On the other side, 1968 is also the beginning of the radical left militant movement, the Naxalbari movement, which was increasingly invisibilizing itself from the cityscape and often making an appearance through the wall graffiti, dead bodies lying on the street, and fragments of broken statues of nationalist icons. It was a year when Robert McNamara, the United States Defense Secretary leading the Vietnam War, but then the World Bank president, visits Calcutta and India. Hundreds and thousands of people gather at the airport where the police chases them off next day in the larger numbers, and in the next day large numbers assemble in front of the USIS to protest. The theatre, which I would like to argue, stands at this crossroad at the intersections of these multiple political, social and cultural trends, representing a vibrant presence in the public sphere. The multiple narratives of the theatre and street dialogues converse and debate, and rarely can such diverse ideas, ideologies, political positions merge into one grand narrative. Theatre in its dialogue with the active public sphere creates a complex deconstruction of the grand narratives, which I would say is, not the sort of history of post-colonial modernity which have been written till date. If Kallol was a narrative of romanticism of revolution and struggled with trying to fragment narratives through various historical strands, 1968 is a far more complex year and could never settle into one narrative structure, which was reflecting in the public sphere. It was compelled to create a multiple narrative, which I would argue was the first time plurality and heterogeneity had to seek out its narrative structures. 3 plays ran at the same time, all documentary theatres in its own right. The first on the Naxalbari shootouts, which happened the year before, which killed 23 peasants in Naxalbari, a play on Vietnam, and a war comedy where the Indian state, was unable to control internal disturbances and was trying to create a jingoistic atmosphere by provoking war with its Chinese and Pakistani neighbors. The theatre played a bigger role in its mediation in bringing the heterogeneous strands of political issues through discussions, participating in current micro and macro issues. I would like to conclude with an example that while the theatre does a play on Naxalbari which presents the peasant positions and standpoints, it also takes a very critical stance on the same political radicalism, particularly when the Naxal started destroying the statues of the nationalist icons, and you know why I picked this example today. And these were statues of Tagore, Vivekananda, Vidyasagar, and others. In a short discursive piece by the same playwright, was presented as a dialogue from a maverick personality, a young theatre enthusiast, dabbling in direction, and a Naxal activist. And this maverick, which is sort of autobiographical of this playwright and author Utpal Dutt, is Jopinda, who actually reprimands and scolds the young Naxalite activist to prove that how destroying Vidyasagar's statue is against his own political imagination. Because without Vidyasagar and his transformation of the Bengali language, he could never have communicated to the people he now imagines to the peasants of Naxalbari he wants to set up a dialogue with. But also Tagore, in his times, as Dutt argues, wrote odes through his plays and poems to young revolutionaries who were taken to die in the gallows under colonialism. At the end of the piece, when the police comes and picks up the activist who had already suffered police torture but stoically confronts the state power, Jopinda stands amidst angry crowds who gather to recite Tagore's lines. Cultural radicalism does not mean iconoclastic denigration, but understanding the layered meaning of why they are there and what does it serve to construct a larger inclusive vision of a new democratic society which was coming up. Grand narratives are always hegemonic, and if we look at possibilities of alternatives in the same mode as what we oppose, we would be constructing other grand narratives of history which is equally hegemonic and monolithic. Let's not impose periods and its larger philosophical criteria to theatre histories and equate fragmented narratives that it could only come with postmodernism, but look in our theatres of the different times for the examples which actually take over theatre practice seriously and find within it these critical departures. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnupriya. You have opened up new perspectives on an exhibition which I was lucky enough to see the last time I visited. Now, Vivan Sundaram gathers up different strands of the fracturing of hegemony, the grand narrative, and then creates his own performance, doesn't he, in the exhibition hall, where there are spectators, many of whom were not present at that time, and through photographs, through the very selection of material and through the arrangement. So, a narrative in a different medium, evolving out of historical events. So, we can have questions after the 4 speakers have finished their presentation. Our next speaker is Mr. Kamal Swarup.
Is there an internet available? Huh? No, is there an internet? Is there Wi-Fi?
Net, there would be Wi-Fi.
Is there? Wi-Fi. नहीं है तो रहने दो पर
नहीं होना चाहिए. It will take 5 minutes.
ओके, तो उसमें एक फाल्के फैक्ट्री करके एक है, वो अगर स्क्रीन करना
Would you like to, you can speak later perhaps. Would you like to speak later so that they can,
No.
Is it possible
it doesn't
to?
matter. For me, narrative can be this side also, that side also, upside also. I don't know.
So while he speaks, maybe we can find it if you give us it.
So, do I have to read a speech or I can just talk?
No, do it your own way. And present what you have to say.
See, from my experience, I'll start from my experience. After passing out from the FTI,